This next bit, I almost wasn't sure if this was worth doing, but I feel like it was. I feel like it is. It might make somebody mad at me or something, but what else? I mean, everyone's mad at me anyway, right? I mean, so for those of you who don't know, there is a Maoist group in the United States called the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP. Now, the leader of the RCP is a guy named Bob Avakian. And Bob Avakian, he's 79 years old. He's the leader of the group. And I actually, before I start, he just gave an interview. He doesn't speak very much, right? He doesn't, he writes articles and stuff, but he doesn't do like media appearances and stuff. But he just gave this like 3-part interview. This interview they're like dropping in 3 parts. And I watched it. I watched some of it. They just dropped the second part. And I heard him talking about foreign policy, about the war in Russia, in Ukraine, and about Taiwan and stuff. And I thought, okay, I'm going to respond to this. But I want to give him his respect. I mean, this is a guy who has spent his life as a communist organizer. He had to flee the country. He went into exile in the early 80s. He was facing very serious criminal charges at one point. He worked with the Black Panthers when they were getting going in the Berkeley area. He was one of the main like white allies of the Black Panthers. He formed the Revolutionary Union, which was a big Maoist group in the 70s, eventually became the Revolutionary Communist Party. The RCP and Bob Avakian, credit is just, they deserve credit where it's due. And they organized around police brutality back before that was a trendy thing to do. And nowadays, everyone talks about Black Lives Matter, police brutality and all that. But it used to be that was not a trendy issue to touch. Mainstream media wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. They didn't want to offend the police. And I remember being in Cleveland and in other cities, the Revolutionary Communist Party, those folks were very dedicated to agitating around police brutality. They did something called the October 22nd Coalition, which was a national day of action about police brutality every year. They put out a book called The Stolen Lives Project, and it was just a book documenting police murders of Black people. They really worked hard for decades and decades around the issue of police brutality before ultimately the BLM stuff really exploded during Obama's presidency. So, in the 90s and the 80s, when that was not a trendy thing to talk about, when Black nationalists and Black community activists talked about it and communists talked about it and nobody else did, the RCP went all in on police brutality and the contribution that they played. I mean, going to court with the family members and victims, protesting every year, getting arrested in demonstrations. I mean, the amount of work that the Revolutionary Communist Party did, that's why Cornel West respects them. Cornel West is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. He's this professor. And Cornel West has done live events with Bob Avakian. He's had Bob Avakian on his radio show before. And, for those of us who are, not in agreement, we're like, why is he doing that? Well, it's because of the fact that the RCP has worked so hard on this issue. They made that the issue that they were focusing on at a time when it wasn't trendy. So Cornel West respects them on some level. And I do respect Bob on some level. I think that he's a person who really believes in what he's saying. He's a person who's given his life to the revolutionary movement, but he's wrong on a number of points. And so I watched his recent interview and I heard him talking about foreign policy, and it was just wrong. I mean, he was saying things that were just not correct. And I as someone who respects him and realizes this is a guy who's been opposing police brutality, who's been opposing wars for years. This is a guy who, supported the Black Panthers. I'm sorry. I have to call out some of the BS, but honestly, he's a little bit better than most of the synthetic left. I'm going to be much more respectful to Bob than I would be to Vosh or somebody like that, because he at least knows you're supposed to be anti-war. He at least knows you're not supposed to side with U.S. imperialism, which is, unfortunately, nowadays, there's all these people calling themselves socialists and communists who like never learned that. They never learned that, like, oh, we're supposed to oppose the war machine. Oh, we're supposed to not echo CNN talking points on foreign policy. But still, if you watch this interview, Bob is just wrong. He doesn't get it. So I'm going to start playing the interview and we'll listen to Bob. And I want to not just talk about why he's wrong in what he's saying, right? That's not the point. It's not just that he's wrong in what he's saying. It's that he came to these conclusions that you're about to hear based on a problematic way of relating to the world and getting information, right? And that's the issue. Bob's a boomer. He's 79 years old. He's almost 80, right? And he looks good. For somebody who's almost 80, he looks good. I mean, this guy's almost an octogenarian. He looks like he's maybe 60 or something, right? He's in pretty good shape for somebody who's 79. This is 79-year-old Bob Avakian explaining foreign policy, explaining, his take on things, calling himself a Marxist-Leninist-Maoist. This is what he's saying, and we're going to talk about it here because it's worth engaging with. I mean, this guy is somebody who presents himself as one of the top communist voices in America, and it could be better. I mean, I'm disappointed by a lot of the things you're about to hear. So here we go.
Oh, Bob Avakian, welcome back to the second part of our interview on the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here.
Okay, so in our previous discussion, we began to discuss the essential analysis and a roadmap that's in your work, Something Terrible or Something Truly Emancipating. And so today we want to dig a bit more into that, and we also want to take a look at the larger objective situation, which is real.
Now, just FYI, so, the one guy interviewing him is a guy named Andy Z. I don't know much about him, but then the other interviewee, that's Sincera Taylor. And Sincera Taylor is an abortion rights activist in New York City. She's had a radio show on WBAI radio before about pro-choice and abortion activism. And she was one of the main people they recently targeted in their cancel culture campaign against the RCP, because her group that she started, Rise Up for Abortion Rights, was gaining a lot of traction. A lot of young women that believe in, fighting for pro-choice stuff were joining her group. And so the mainstream media just went all in against Sincera Taylor, all in against Rise Up for Abortion Rights. They called it a cult. They said it engages in brainwashing, blah, 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 blah. So, respect to Sincera too, even though I don't agree. I don't think pro-choice is what we should be organizing around. Like, she's been viciously targeted recently because of the fact that she is a Maoist communist, and she, is part of the RCP. And because of that, her abortion activism has been smeared. I mean, it's pretty wild. They have really just made it clear you are not allowed to be a communist in the synthetic left. Doesn't matter if you're pro-choice. Doesn't matter if you make LGBT the central issue. Doesn't matter if you denounce Russia and China. If you are a legit communist, you really believe in class struggle, you really are against U.S. imperialism, you are not welcome in left-wing spaces. And they're doing that to the RCP right now. And they did that to Sincera Taylor. She is just a regular Maoist communist who believes in a woman's right to an abortion. And The Intercept ran a hit piece on her, and the Daily Beast ran a hit piece on her, and they canceled the RCP. I mean, it's unbelievable what they've done to her. So respect points to her as well. But anyway,
down on humanity right now. We want to begin with this heightened danger towards war, including a major war. So first of all, what is shaking the major power centers, and as people all over the world, I think, very concerned, is Putin's outrageous declaration to annex 1/5, I believe, of the country of Ukraine, territories that are currently contested, if not even dominated now by the Ukraine. And so that as part of this, he declared that any attack on this territory would be considered an attack on Russia and treated as such, including potentially the use of nuclear weapons. And then there's Biden answering in kind, threatening him back, and even as you were bringing out the other
so none of that is true, what he just said there, but we'll get to that later.
Day, informally, that he's threatening China over Taiwan. So it's a very dangerous situation. But it would be very helpful, I think, and people want to know from you what's going on here, and how should people understand this situation?
Well, I think the most essential thing is this is contention among different imperialist powers. The U.S. has been the dominant power in the world, and Russia went through the whole thing where the Soviet Union imploded. It hadn't been socialist for a long time, but it had been pretending to be socialist, and then eventually gave that up, and the Soviet Union went out of existence. And Russia became very weak. They had that guy Yeltsin in there who could hardly stay sober for a day, as a head of state, and Russia became basically just, very subordinate to the U.S. and to the whole, quote unquote, Western alliance. And ever since Putin came in, his whole program has been to reassert, Russian first of all, Russian integrity, but also just Russian influence in the world, as an imperialist power, which...
All right. So first things first. Now, what is imperialism? What is imperialism? Imperialism is not a definition for powerful country. It's not a synonymous with powerful country. Imperialism is not it's not a term that just means a country invades or attacks another country. It doesn't mean a military power. Imperialism is an economic system. Lenin wrote a very important book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And Bob calls himself a Marxist-Leninist-Maoist. He should have read that book, and I'm sure he has. Well, Bob should revisit Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And in that book, he will learn that imperialism is defined by the rule of the world, by big monopolies and banks that are carving out the world as a captive market. Imperialism is the export of capital. When big corporations based in Western countries start, dominating and exporting their power and influence all over the world. Under industrial capitalism, the countries exported products, but under imperialism, they export the enterprises themselves. Multinational corporations dominate the planet. And that is not what Russia is doing. Economically speaking, it doesn't apply to Russia. Russia's economy is centered around selling their own oil and their own natural gas. Not anybody else's oil, not anyone else's natural gas, but their own. And they export oil and gas on the international markets. And in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was economically devastated. And then Putin rebuilt Russia's economy by taking Gazprom and Rosneft, two state-controlled energy corporations, and building them up. And Russia's economy is centered around selling their own natural resources. That is not imperialism. They're not going around the world plundering other people's, plundering and controlling the international markets. They're not plundering other people's resources. They're not dominating the markets of impoverished countries. They are selling their own natural resources. They have two state-run energy corporations. They've also got state-run mining corporations. And yes, they have a big private sector, but Russia's economy is simply not an imperialist economy. Russia is not extracting super profits from impoverished countries, from poorer countries. It's just not happening. That's just not how their economy works, right? The way Wall Street works, the way, Silicon Valley, the way the big tech monopolies and giants work is that they are extracting surplus value from other countries. Russia's just not doing that. Now, obviously, they don't call themselves a socialist country, and they have a huge amount of inequality there, and there's corruption, etc. But they are not an imperialist country by any means. There are countries that are aligned with them, but Russia's not extracting surplus value from them. It's almost the opposite. Russia's spending all their money building them up. I've been to Crimea, and we'll get to some of this stuff later, but I mean, he needs to revisit the definition of imperialism. Just because a country's powerful, just because a country has a lot of influence, doesn't make it imperialist. And Russia is not trying to keep the world poor so they can rake in super profits. Russia is not trying to hold back development in the countries that are aligned with it. Quite the opposite. Look at what they're doing with the Eurasian Economic Union. I've been to the Yalta Economic Forum. I've been to the Sochi, the Valdy Discussion Club in Sochi. Russia's economic relationship with countries across the world, in Africa, in Eurasia, in South America. I mean, they're helping Cuba to build itself up. They're helping Venezuela. They're helping Brazil. Russia's economic relationship, yes, it trades with countries. And yes, there are for-profit capitalist corporations in Russia that make profits, but they are not keeping countries poor. They're not, joining, they're not beating countries down so they'll be captive markets for Russia. That isn't happening. Russia has a lot of partnerships. Its state-run industries have partnerships with the mining corporations, with the natural gas extraction corporations in other countries, but they're partnerships where they're building up the industries and the domestic industries of these countries. Imperialism means you go into a country and you destroy its domestic economy. So it has to rely on you, right? Imperialism is the fact that, that big corporations from the United States dominate the global markets. We'll write it down. Thoughts on the Great Deal. Imperialism is, for example, Mexico. The people of Mexico have been growing their own food for, thousands of years, since before Christopher Columbus came. But now, because of imperialism, because of big multinational corporations based in the United States and NAFTA, Mexico has to import all their food from the United States. The Mexican farming sector has been put out of business. That's what imperialism is. It's an economic relationship, right? Haiti used to have its own farming sector as well, but under NAFTA, Bill Clinton enabled American products to come in there and flood the market, put the domestic farmers, and now Haiti imports most of its food from the United States, right? It used to be that Iraq was an independent country that sold oil on the international markets, competing with Wall Street, competing with London oil corporations. Well, now Iraq has been blown to bits, and everyone who is purchasing from Iraq has to purchase from the United States or from Saudi Arabia. Imperialism is the fact that Nigeria is the top oil exporting country in Africa. The Niger Delta region is the most oil-rich part of the African continent, yet the people there are dirt poor because the oil in Nigeria is controlled by ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. And even though they have this huge, very valuable resource, oil, the people in Nigeria are deeply poor. That's imperialism. Imperialism refers to an economic relationship that is about holding back economic development, keeping countries impoverished. And Russia is not doing that. Objectively, Russia is just not doing that. There are African countries that do business with Russia, but Russia builds up their state-run energy companies. Russia builds up their state-run mining companies. African countries at the UN vote overwhelmingly. They were overwhelmingly abstaining from these anti-Russia resolutions because of the fact that many of them have really benefited from an economic relationship with Russia. That Russia has gone there and enabled them to build up their economies. Read about the Eurasian Economic Union. Read about what Russia does in Africa. I mean, it's not imperialism. It's an economic relationship, but it's not imperialism. So he needs to revisit the definition of imperialism. But we will continue. Continue, Bob.
What it is, it's a openly capitalist and imperialist power.
No, it's
and
not.
It's trying to break out of the subordinate position that it's been in particularly since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And so this explains what he's been doing. He went into Georgia and a number of years back, and
No. Georgia, which was a U.S.-aligned country that used to be part of the Soviet Union. I'm not talking about, the state in the U.S. South. I'm talking about Georgia in Central Asia. Georgia, a U.S.-aligned puppet government, attacked South Ossetia and bombed South Ossetia. It was the United States and Georgia that started that. They attacked South Ossetia in 2008. They attacked this territory of South Ossetia. And as a result, Russia then retaliated because Russia has recognized that South Ossetia is an independent territory. They don't want to be part of Georgia. And so then when the Georgian government attacked South Ossetia, Russia said, all right, we have a treaty that we are going to protect South Ossetia. So they retaliated. No, he didn't go into Georgia. That didn't happen. Georgia attacked South Ossetia, and then Russia retaliated to protect South Ossetia.
And now into Ukraine. And, I think we could speculate, but I think Putin made some miscalculations. That I think he felt that the U.S. and its Western imperialist alliance would make a lot of noise. Maybe they'd do some economic sanctions, but I don't really think that he understood that they would really throw as much into this as they have. This is basically a war being fought by the U.S. with Ukrainian soldiers.
No, Russia knew how bad this was, and that's why Russia held off for so long. This all started in 2014 when the United States overthrew the government of Ukraine. And then the eastern regions, the Russian-speaking regions, then the Donbass, they voted to be independent from the central government. They created the Donetsk People's Republic, the People's Republic of Lugansk. And Russia held off, and they negotiated the Minsk agreement, the Minsk Accords. They didn't want to do this because they knew what the United States was doing. They knew the US was trying to set up another Afghanistan, another Afghan trap to lure them in it. And Russia did everything they could to not intervene because they knew what was going on. They saw those caches of US made weapons piling into Kiev. I mean, they saw the way US media was whipping up support. They knew what was going on, and Russia tried not to. No, it's not that they went in and they thought they could get away with it. No. They tried their hardest to not do it, Bob. Bob, you don't know what you're talking about here. They tried not to. Russia doesn't want to be intervening. Russia has wanted not to do this for so long. You don't get it, Bob. You don't get it.
Against Russian imperialism, and all the intelligence, increasingly the planning, the heavy armament, the most up-to-date weapons. This is all U.S. And it's just the Ukrainians are the foot soldiers and the cannon fodder for.
Well, he's right about that. He's absolutely right about that, and good on him for saying that. That's one thing he's definitely right about. Is that the Ukrainians are basically just being used as U.S. proxies. This isn't a fight for Ukraine's sovereignty. This isn't the Ukrainian people heroically resisting the invader. No, this is the Ukrainians being used as the foot soldiers and the cannon fodder of U.S. imperialism. So at least he gets that. But continue, Bob. Continue.
On that side of it, the U.S. has openly declared that its intention is to administer a defeat to Russia in order to weaken its overall challenge to U.S. imperialism. So, that's why they've thrown everything they have into it. Just to go back for a second, I think Putin also miscalculated, thinking that he could send in the sort of lightly armed troops and quickly take over the country. And he probably preferred to do that from the point of view of then you have more of a country, that's intact rather than.
I mean, that's just wrong also, militarily speaking. That's not what happened, but I'm not going to get into that.
One that's devastated. And that was a miscalculation because already, not only were the Ukrainians putting up a resistance, but the U.S. was already throwing a lot in to help them. So the U.S. has openly declared that its goal is to administer defeat to Russia. And on the other side, Putin is very clear he's not going to accept a defeat for the same kind of logic. It's imperialist gangster logic. Neither side can afford to suffer a defeat. So what do you get then?
Well, no. That the people in the eastern regions have been dying for 8 years, and they've been facing a bombardment, and Russia has finally said, okay, we have an obligation to protect these people. It's not Russia just wants to secure the people of the eastern regions that have been bombed and food blockaded and had their language wiped, outlawed, and have been suffering for 8 years. And Russia did everything they possibly could to not have it come to this. They facilitated the Minsk agreement. They very much they tried to get Ukraine to just bring these people back in and respect their rights. And they held off for it's not gangster logic. It's that and then Russia wants to negotiate this. They want to negotiate a de-escalation. They want to de-escalate this conflict and make sure that those regions that have now voted to join with Russia are recognized. But let's continue.
Putin talks about, okay, now this territory that you're referring to that they've annexed through these ridiculous referenda.
Oh,
by the way, just speaking of ridiculous.
Okay, those referendums. Why is it outrageous to think that an area that's been bombed for 8 years by the government in Kiev, an area where they speak Russian as their language, and the government in Kiev has outlawed it, an area that's been subject to a food blockade. Why is it outrageous to think they might then want to join with Russia? That makes perfect sense. These regions didn't even vote to break with Ukraine recently. They broke to break with Ukraine in 2014. When they had the independence referendums. They declared independence from the central government in 2014. The Donetsk People's Republic, the Lugansk People's Republic, they voted in 2014 to break away. They speak Russian in this area. They have Soviet memorials that they're very, very proud of. And the government in Kiev has then started bombing them, using drones against them. They killed 14,000, more like 16,000 civilians. Why is it outrageous to think that they might then vote to join the Russian Federation? They already voted for independence. Russia held off recognizing them as independent countries until now, but Russia is now militarily protecting them from a government that's been starving and bombing them for 8 years straight. I mean, why? What's ridiculous about this? I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, if there was a state in the United States, like if Pennsylvania voted to break away from the United States, and the U.S. central government said no, and then it started bombing them and killed 16,000 of them, and it blocked food from getting into Pennsylvania, and it outlawed the regional languages and started doing everything they could to suppress them. And finally, Canada said, all right, we're going to come in and protect the people of Pennsylvania. Would it be outrageous that Pennsylvania might vote to join with Canada? It's not outrageous at all. It makes perfect sense. These referendums are completely logical. Anyone under such circumstances, if you're being bombed and killed and starved by one government, and then another government finally says, okay, we're going to protect you, why would you not join with them? There's nothing illogical. There's nothing irrational. These referendums make complete sense. They speak Russian. The government in Kiev has outlawed the Russian language. There's nothing at all unbelievable or outrageous about these referendums. These referendums make perfect sense. They're completely logical. I mean, again, he doesn't get this, and we'll get to why in a little bit. But anyway, let's continue.
Referenda, I have to say this. Once again, world-class hypocrisy from the U.S. imperialists. They went into Iraq,
See, good. He gets this, but he's right about this next part, right? Which is good. I mean, and that's why the RCP is being canceled. They are still leftists, right? They're not CIA fake socialists. They understand that you have to be against the U.S. imperialists. So he's at least pointing to the hypocrisy.
Occupied the country illegally. It was a violation of international law, just a blatant international war crime. They went into Iraq, got rid of the existing government, put in a puppet government, and then held elections while their troops are occupying the country. But that was a free and fair election, don't you know?
Yeah, good on him for pointing out this hypocrisy. He's got that. At least he knows you shouldn't support U.S. imperialism. I mean, that alone makes Bob 1,000 times better than Vosh. That makes Bob 1,000 times better than ContraPoints. That makes Vosh 1,000 times better from the DSA, whatever. I mean, at least he recognizes that there's hypocrisy on the part of the imperialists. At least he understands that the main danger is the imperialists at home. Revolutionary defeatism. Do folks know what revolutionary defeatism is? It's one of the most basic Leninist concepts. That if you're a revolutionary, a working class revolutionary, you welcome the defeat of your own imperialism, right? If you live in the U.S. imperialist homeland, you want U.S. imperialism to be defeated, right? If you live in France, in the homeland of French imperialism, you want French imperialism to be defeated. If you are a revolutionary fighting for the working class in the imperialist homeland, it is your responsibility to stand against the crimes of your own government and to rally the working class there in opposition to the imperialists who run your homeland. So as an American communist, it is his duty to oppose U.S. imperialism. And that's just basic. This is called revolutionary defeatism. It's one of the most basic Leninist concepts. The RCP and Bob Avakian, they still believe in that. As flawed as what he's saying about Russia is, he still understands and upholds revolutionary defeatism, whereas most of the synthetic left are straight up social imperialists. They are straight up social patriots, social imperialists. They support all-out attacks on anyone who opposes Western capitalism. They think Western capitalism is a good force in the world because it's got a woke makeover, and because Kamala Harris is vice president, and we have rainbow LGBT flags. So at least the RCP is holding on to revolutionary defeatism, right? Which is that's called common sense. Any communist, any socialist would be revolutionary defeatist 10, 20 years ago. Until the synthetic left had its complete hegemony, that was considered common sense. But there you go.
But now when Putin does the same thing in these sections of Ukraine, that he's this is,
It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. They voted for independence 8 years ago in 2014. It's not the same thing, right? They already voted for independence. Now they're voting to join with Russia because Russia's militarily protecting them. But
sham. This is, everybody has to denounce this. I mean, can't you see what how ridiculous this is? This is anything but a free, fair election, unlike the ones we had in Iraq when we were occupying. Of course, they don't really say that, but that's the reality of it, right? So, Putin has annexed these sections of the Ukraine, and he has made a statement that any threat to the integrity, of Russia or to the territory of Russia, any threat, he will use all weapons available, which means, and he repeated it twice and said this is not a bluff. It means that puts nuclear weapons on the table, even if you're talking about two.
Wrong. Okay, so here's what happened. Russia has had the same policy for a long time, which is that if Russian territory is attacked, under those circumstances, they might use nuclear weapons, right? And that they've had that same policy for long before this Ukraine shit started, right? They had the same policy, which is that, that if Russian territory is attacked, they will use nuclear weapons. At no point has Russia said that they're planning to use nuclear weapons? Oh, you better not fight us in Ukraine or else they've never done that. It was the NATO countries that brought up nuclear weapons. The French government, the forces in Ukraine that were talking about getting nuclear weapons for Ukraine, they're the ones that brought nuclear weapons into this. Russia has never threatened the use of nuclear weapons throughout this conflict. All they've said is that, yes, our policy is if Russia gets attacked, we have the right to use nuclear weapons in our self-defense. They've had the exact same policy for years, that if they are invaded, that might be a circumstance in which they use nuclear weapons. But Russia is not threatening to nuke anybody. Russia is not threatening nuclear intervention. I mean, this is not true, okay? And I mean, I'm sorry, but it's like Russia is not threatening to nuke anybody. The government in Kiev, the US-backed Kiev government, on the other hand, they actually talked about getting nuclear weapons and putting nukes right on Russia's border. So he's just wrong. He's just wrong here.
Tactical nuclear weapons, these have tremendous devastating effect. Let's not pretend they're some minor thing, just tactical. They have tremendous devastating effect. So he's taken that stand. Now the U.S. is saying, well, if Putin does that, then we'll, I've seen some military analysts on the U.S. side, we'll go in and destroy all of his forces in Ukraine, knock out his fleet, and so on and so forth. And then what do you think Putin would do? They're saying, oh, well, we won't go nuclear. Even if Putin goes nuclear, we won't go nuclear. We'll just destroy all of his troops and his fleet, devastate his fleet. So what is Putin going to do in a situation like that? This is what I point out in this article. You get on this very deadly trajectory of escalation where neither side can accept a defeat, and pretty soon you're at the threshold of strategic nuclear weapons that could do devastation to the entire world and, vast numbers, if not humanity as a whole.
And again, to his credit, he understands that the U.S. imperialists are playing with fire. He understands that they're escalating things to a nuclear level. He gets that, but here's what the problem is. And I mean, it's might as well just say this now. He's doing what a lot of boomer leftists do. And again, I give him respect for all of his years of organizing around police brutality, raising Marxism, going into, having to flee the country to France, supporting the Black Panthers. This guy, he deserves his credit, okay? He's not a bad dude. He's done a lot of good stuff in his life, but he's doing what a lot of boomer leftists do, which is that he thinks he can read the New York Times. He thinks he can read the New York Times and bring with it his understanding of communism, and based on that, understand world events. And to be fair, at one point, you could do that. During the Vietnam years, one could read the New York Times, which was a more liberal, kind of critical paper. And if you then had a communist understanding, you could understand what was happening. Back then, the New York Times was much more of a serious journalist operation, right? Back then, especially the printed media was much more meticulous and careful. They didn't print blatant lies like they do now. I mean, they did sometimes, but if you read the more academic U.S. media, like New York Times, like like Foreign Affairs magazine, things like that. You could get a more accurate picture, and then if you brought with it your Marxist understanding, you could understand what's going on. That is no longer the case. That is not the case anymore, right? That is just not the case anymore. Now the mainstream media outlets, they just go out of their way to lie. And the reason that they go out of their way to lie is because there is alternative media out there. Bob should watch RT. Bob Avakian should watch RT. If Bob Avakian watched RT, he would understand about the referendums. He wouldn't have said all the stupid things about the referendums he just said. He would understand, oh, wow, this started 8 years ago. They voted for independence 8 years ago. They're being bombed. Of course they would want, he would understand if he watched RT, right? You have to watch RT nowadays. You have to, you have to check out Jimmy Dore. You have to check out the Duran, right? You got to check out Mint Press. You got to be tuned in to anti-imperialist media, because the mainstream media has gotten to be so biased that you can't. It's not the New York Times. During the Vietnam War, during the 70s and 80s, you could read the New York Times, and if you had your Marxist interpretation, you could understand it. That's what's going on here. He's been reading the New York Times. He thinks the New York Times are giving him the facts, and then he's bringing his Marxist skepticism with him. Well, that might have worked in times past. That doesn't work anymore. You can't do that. You got to be tuned into alternative media, because the New York Times didn't used to just so blatantly lie. Now they do. Right. The New York Times and this isn't the age of Walter Cronkite. OK, Walter Cronkite is dead and replaced by Rachel fucking Maddow. All right. Rachel Maddow is running things, and she just lies. All right. Walter Cronkite, as bad as Walter Cronkite was, he made an effort to be accurate. He understood to some degree or other it was his job to be critical of the rich and powerful, to kind of, it used to be an understanding. And this is the sad thing. It used to be an understanding on the part of the U.S. imperialists that they needed, the, what do you call it? The dark angel or whatever, right? If you talk about, in Christianity, right, the understanding of Satan is very different from the understanding of Satan in Judaism. In Judaism, the understanding is that Satan is an angel who works for God to test your faith, right? It keeps you on your toes, right? If you read the book of Job in the Bible, for example, right? Satan is always going to God and saying, I'm going to make hardship happen to Job to see if he's really loyal to you, right? That Satan is supposed to be the skeptic. He's supposed to be the one who is always saying, wait, what about this? And asking the tough questions, right? Right. And that's kind of how the U.S. imperialists used to see the role of media. That's how they used to see the role of academia and college. The idea was that the media was supposed to keep the press, the politicians on their toes. The media was supposed to keep, the academics were supposed to be challenging the status quo, that you were supposed to have free thinkers at your universities. You were supposed to have, journalists who ask tough questions in order to keep everyone honest. They don't think that no more. They do not think that anymore. Right? Nowadays, you go to college and they teach you not to think. In college, they're vetting you to make sure that you are a blind, loyal apologist to U.S. imperialism. And if you don't have any dissident thoughts, you can get an A+. They reward you, and then you might be qualified to be part of the professional managerial class. It used to be, my family, my whole life, and boomers. The world they grew up in is very different than the world we have today. In boomers, in the time they were growing up, college was a place for free thinkers. Like my whole family said to me, Caleb, you're going to love college. You're going to love college. I hated college. But, if I had been growing up in boomer times, I would have loved college, right? Because college was a place for free thinkers. It's not that anymore. Now college is a place for cancel culture, and college is a place for intellectual vetting, right? That now that the broad masses of people have dissenting ideas, now that the broad masses of people are critical of the wars, college is a place where they make sure that you are not buying into any of that Russian disinformation. You're not buying into those conspiracy theories. You're questioning things. College is a place where they make sure you're not thinking critically. And they give you that degree to say, okay, he's been vetted. He's not a free thinker. He's not critical. He understands to repeat the party line. The role of academia has completely changed. And the same for the press. right? I mean, the press used to see its job as keeping, they were their job was to keep the United States honest, to ask the tough questions. They don't do that no more. Now the role of the press is to repeat exactly what the State Department says, to repeat exactly what the government says. And if they say something different, their job is to demonize it, call it conspiracy theories and all of that. Walter Cronkite is dead. Rachel Maddow has replaced Walter Cronkite, and Bob he's using old, outdated tools to understand the world. He's doing his best, and we respect him for it. Right? He's still skeptical, which most of the synthetic left scumbags are not. Right? They're not even critical at all. Bob at least has held on to his healthy skepticism, but he still believes he can read the New York Times, read what liberal college professors are saying, and then bring with him his communist background and understand what's going on. Doesn't work that way anymore.
So this is what we're up against, and the big problem is, I mean, I just have to comment, like you got all these people that pretend that they're progressive and whatever, and they're all going right along with U.S. imperialism and this, and under the banner that Biden and all these people are putting out about this is a world, this is a contest in the United States and throughout the world between democracy and autocracy. Trump is an autocrat. Putin is an autocrat. Xi Jinping is an autocrat. Of course, they don't talk about their own autocrats, like the heads of the government, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, you can go down the list, that are all part of their alliance. Hungary, Poland, what have you. Those are all autocratic governments. But there are autocratic governments, like they said about the Shah of Iran.
See, this is an outdated argument too, right? This is the Cold War. The USA backs dictators while condemning communist dictatorships. And it's a little more complicated than that, because there is hostility to Hungary. There is hostility to Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, right? That during the Cold War, the United States had to prop up, we'll get to that, right? Oh, shooter. Friends in. During the Cold War, the United States, they had to prop up various, military strongmen around the world as a barrier against communism. But as the Cold War was coming to an end, they started, backing color revolutions against those guys because they want a weak government. They want a weak government that won't be able to get in the way of austerity. And, the government in Hungary, the government in Saudi Arabia, to some degree or other, even though they're U.S. aligned, they are still seen as kind of a threat because a strong government can say no to Western liberal capitalism. A strong government, requires it has to deliver the goods economically. So it's not as simple as he makes it out to be. During the Cold War, yes, they liked Pinochet, they hated Mao. Yes, they liked Marcos, and they hated Fidel Castro. But it's not that simple anymore. Now the imperialists are against any strong government. Any strong government, that delivers the good economically and tries, at least to some degree or other, to control the economy, to make a better economy, the imperialists are going to target. And so it's a little more complicated than that. But continue, Bob.
Back in 1978, when the uprising was occurring, which eventually led to his overthrow, there was an article that said the Shah, in one of the major newspapers in this country, that said the Shah of Iran may be a despot, but he's our despot.
Right.
So, our autocrats are okay, but the ones that are challenging our dominance in the world and our ability to plunder and slaughter people all over the world, which is what they've been doing forever, those autocrats are no good.
Yeah, but now they don't even like their own autocrats because their own autocrats can say no to them to some degree or other. Like, that's what he's missing. They want an open international system, just complete free trade, impoverishing the whole world. And, strongman Bonapartist governments get in their way. And, that's why, there's kind of a push against Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is awful, but, and it's a complete U.S. aligned regime. But to some degree or other, it has the ability to say no to them. And on Russia, it hasn't played ball with them completely because Russia is a country they need to negotiate with around the oil prices and such. So this is an outdated kind of Cold War understanding.
This is not a battle. Just even looking beneath the surface, you can see that this is a battle between imperialist powers, all of which, on both sides, have
Russia's
whole
not
histories of
imperialist.
horrendous atrocities, and base themselves on vicious exploitation of people and oppression of people all over the world. This is what's at stake. And I just have to say, certain people who have postured as being progressive have come out and made the most outrageous statements in the context thing. And I'm going to say it, little Stephen, coming out and saying, well, we're more powerful than Russia. Why don't we just bomb the shit out of them? I mean, what are these people thinking? They're so committed, ultimately, despite their progressive pretensions, they're so committed to U.S. imperialism that they've almost lost their fucking minds.
Good for him. He's so right about this. It's like this is just common sense among leftists that you don't cheer for World War III. In his day, that was just common sense, right? That any leftist was anti-war. You didn't cheer for the United States attacking another country. But now synthetic leftism and woke imperialism has become so dominant, even as kind of out of touch as he is on what's actually happening on the ground. He gets this. He gets that the left is now dominated by pro-imperialist schmucks who are woke imperialists. He gets that.
What do you think is going to happen? You go bomb Russia. Why don't we just wipe out all their air force? I mean, this kind of talk is totally reckless and irresponsible. And when it comes from people with so-called progressive pretensions, it's all the more disgusting. I just have to say that. And people need to get up off this American chauvinism. This country, look, and some of the same people who would rattle on about the whole history of this country and slavery and all that, turn around and, and are either silent or openly supportive of the same system when it goes into the international arena.
Yes, he gets it. Exactly. Wokeism is about enabling the U.S. imperialists to plunder. It's about attempting to clear their name, attempting to disassociate them from their past. He gets it. Wokeism is just an attempt to give imperialism a makeover so they can do more wars. He gets it. He gets it.
To enforce its parasitism of plundering and exploiting people all over the world, because I guess they have a little bit of a sense. It's like somebody once said, somebody once wrote saying, living in this country is a little bit like living in the house of Tony Soprano. You know that there's a lot of goodies coming in. You don't know exactly, maybe you're not really entirely up on what Tony Soprano's doing out there, but you kind of have a sense that whatever he's doing, and however fucked up you might think it would be, is allowing you to have all the goodies that comes from living in the house. And that's what that's what the attitude of a lot of these American chauvinists, so-called progressives. And people need to get up off this and wake up to what's actually happening and you think the history of this ruling class in this country is somehow divorced from what they do in the world as a whole? Do you think their nature changes when they go outside the borders of the U.S. and all of a sudden they become, really kind-hearted people,
He gets it, right? And wokeism, the BLM rainbow flag MSNBC bullshit, the college gender and race critical studies bullshit is about enabling U.S. imperialism to go out and commit the crimes again with a clean slate and say, oh, look, we've changed. Oh, look, we've changed. We acknowledge systemic racism. Oh, look, we've changed. And now it's about giving them the ability to do it again. So he's right on point here. I wish he would take that further and realize that means we need to get out of the movement to the masses. I wish he would take that further and realize that Russia and China are not imperialist. They're our allies, but he gets it on some level. He at least is trying to hold on to the basic anti-imperialist, revolutionary defeatist gut level instincts that used to be common on the left.
Carrying out charity around the world, they do some charity to cover up the crimes that they're committing. I mean, we came forward, me and people of my generation came forward during Vietnam, the Vietnam War. And, I did a lot of study of that, and so did many other people, to see what was actually going on in that war. And, we discovered that, and this is why a lot of the American troops rebelled, because of the atrocities they were being ordered to carry out. I mean, wiping out whole villages, with old people and children, just wiping them out, shooting babies. And I'm not exaggerating. Go look into it if you think I'm exaggerating. They killed between 2 and 3 million civilians in the country of Vietnam, which at the time had a population maybe of only a little more than 10 times that. The troops, not only were they, turning whole sections of women in the capital of Saigon and other places, forcing them into prostitution, but they were mass raping women, in these villages, all, you can just read up on this, and so this is not.
And what did they call all the people who pointed this out? When Americans went out and said, yes, they're murdering civilians in Vietnam. Yes, they're murdering civilians on the Korean Peninsula. What did they say? They called it Russian propaganda. They called it Russian disinformation. They said it's communist propaganda. It's communist disinformation. That's what they did. That's what they did. They called it communist propaganda, communist disinformation, the same kind of hysteria they use now. If you ever bring up the truth about what the forces in Kiev are doing, what the US-backed Nazis in Ukraine are doing, what do they immediately do? They call it Russian propaganda. And he was with a group of people during the 1960s that thought for themselves and actually dug into the truth and found out the evil things that US imperialism is doing.
Changed. The nature of this system that did all that in Vietnam has not changed.
Yes, and it hasn't changed, even though they've given it a woke makeover, even though they talk about BLM flags, even though they are obsessed with transgender stuff. It hasn't changed. The same system, the same Pentagon is doing it, the same big banks and corporations. Yes.
What has changed is some of the people opposing them are not people you can support, like Islamic fundamentalists who carry out all kinds of atrocities of their own, although on a scale, they can only envy what the U.S. imperialists do on the scale that they do it.
The left has forgotten all of this. They've forgotten that U.S. imperialism is the main enemy.
Or Russia and China. You mentioned China. First of all, Nancy Pelosi goes to Taiwan. Supposedly, everybody doesn't challenge the insistence by the Chinese government in Beijing that Taiwan is part of China. Supposedly even the U.S. policy doesn't challenge that, even though they have all these relations with Taiwan. Well, she went over there and essentially said differently, and basically treated Taiwan as an independent country, and it was a deliberate provocation. And I'm not defending the Chinese imperialist rulers. We're very clear that they're also capitalist imperialists and have been since capitalism was restored in China shortly after the death of Mao decades ago in 1976. But nevertheless, this was a provocation, and then it's followed up by Biden making a point of having himself interviewed where he can say, answer the question, well, if the Chinese, meaning the Chinese on the mainland, the People's Republic of China, attacks Taiwan, will the U.S. troops, in other words, U.S. armed forces, get involved on the side of Taiwan? He made look, when you interview the President of the United States.
All right. I'm going to stop it right there and just kind of react to that because, again, he's talking about how Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan was a provocation. Good, it was. But like the Taiwan issue, if he's a Maoist, if he calls himself a Maoist, Taiwan should be like a central issue to him. Right? I mean, there is nothing more Maoist. Mao, Chinese Communist Party. I mean, people in China who like Mao, they are fired up about Taiwan being part of China. And he kind of, he gets it, right? He gets that it's a provocation, but he's not really getting into detail about it. And he's saying China is imperialist. And, and this is what somewhat years ago, I remember I was in college and I had a friend. It was a college librarian, older guy. He spoke Chinese fluently. He had lived in China. He'd lived in Vietnam. He spoke Vietnamese also. I remember I was at an anti-war protest. This was back during the Bush years, back during the time that Iraq was, being occupied and invaded by the United States. And I was protesting it. And he actually gave me a lift. He picked me up from downtown Cleveland. I got in the car with him and he started trying to get me to understand things. I'll never forget this conversation. He tried to get me to understand things. And he said, Caleb, these people that you just were at that anti-war rally with you, if communism ever came to America, they would be the first people against it. And I thought, that's crazy. What is he talking about? And he said, and if Mao lived in the United States, if Mao was in America right now, he would go to the poorest part of Appalachia, and he would start some kind of George Washington Bible gun club. And I heard that and I thought, well, that can't be right. No, he was right, right? In China, communism was an expression of loving China, loving your homeland. It was an expression of patriotism. It was an expression of embracing China as a great country that's been held down. It was an expression of being loyal and upstanding, and that communism was not an activity for alienated intellectuals who didn't fit in with the society they were in. Communism was an expression of being loyal to the homeland, of being patriotic, of being militaristic, of being disciplined. That what Bob is, Bob doesn't get that, like, if he's a Maoist, Taiwan should be like something he obsesses over. Read the Little Red Book. There's a quote in the Little Red Book. The USA has invaded China's territory of Taiwan. It's like Taiwan is a central issue if you're a Maoist, right? Now, I think Bob understands that to some degree or other, but the way he approached this is just kind of like, oh, Chinese imperialist, US imperialist, like he doesn't get it. If he was really in with what the Chinese communists were all about, he should be getting fired up about Taiwan. He should be getting really fired up about Taiwan, but he's not doing that because Bob is a communist in America. He's from the Vietnam War generation. The Vietnam War was happening. He protested it very heroically. He took a stand against Cold War conformity. He didn't like the militarism and the McCarthyism of U.S. society during the Cold War. That's all very respectable, but that's not what communism is really about, right? Communism, when it gets down to it, is an illiberal movement. It is an expression of illiberalism. It is opposition to the liberal order. It's an illiberal movement that's about reorganizing the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few. And it is a populist movement. It is the broad masses of people, the poorest people, the workers and the farmers and the peasants and the poor and the downtrodden being mobilized to fight for their own interests and forming a block, giving up their individuality to some degree or other, right? Becoming part of a solid core, a movement, a dedicated movement of people. It's an illiberal formation. It's not intellectual free thinkers. It's not, saying, I want to do my own thing, man. It is not this 1960s New Left. It's something completely different. He knows that, okay? I'm not saying anything he doesn't know, right? There's millions of videos on the internet, not millions, but many videos on the internet of people correcting me and saying things that I clearly was not saying, and I know. And Bob knows this to some degree or other, but he doesn't really grasp it. And what that librarian was trying to explain to me, that guy who'd lived in China, that guy who'd lived in Vietnam, what he was trying to explain to me when he said if Mao was in America, he'd be in Appalachia organizing a George Washington Bible gun club. He'd been there. He'd lived in China. He knew what communism was about. He'd been to Vietnam. He knew what communism was about. And it wasn't dissident intellectuals doing their own thing, man. It was an illiberal movement of poor people fighting for their country, fighting for their homeland, embracing their values, So that's kind of what I wanted to get out of my system there.